All right, this is part 2 of our series, When God Feels Absent. If you listened last week, you'll remember that at the end of 1 Samuel 4, things looked about as bleak for Israel as they could possibly be. The army had been decimated by the Philistines, old priests who had shepherded Israel for so long. Eli and his sons all died in a single day. The Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence to his people, in an unthinkable act, had been carried off by the Philistines. The Israelites' condition was summarized by a single name, Ichabod, that a dying woman named her child. Ichabod, the glory is gone. They can't find God. Now, here's what I want to do with this message today. The 5th chapter of 1 Samuel goes on to tell what God does to get free in the minds of the ancient world. When the ark got captured, it was like God got carried off from his people. And 1 Samuel 5 talks about what God does to get free and come home to his people. In a little while, on the back half of this message, we're going to look at that. But before we do that, I want to look with you at this question. What do you do when you feel like God is absent? When you have problems and they're not going away, and worse than that, you feel like you can't hear from God, like you pray, and it's like you don't sense anything coming back. You don't know what God wants you to do. He doesn't seem to be giving any guidance or any help or any answers. What do you do then? What do you do when God feels absent? And that happens sometimes in the lives of just about everyone I know. And maybe for you, that's going on right now. Israel had a lot of experiences with this problem. So if you feel like you're going through this right now, know that you are not alone. What I want to do in the first part of this message is walk you through 4 practices that the Israelites would engage in and hang on to when it felt like God was far away. And I want to express each practice in a single word. All you have to remember today is just 4 practices, just 4 words that you're going to do when it feels like God is far away. All right, so here's the first one. It's a very important word, and it might actually surprise you a little bit. The first thing you need to do is complain. You need to complain. There is a fascinating paradox in the book of Psalms, which is the great prayer book of Israel. The Hebrew name for the Psalms was Tehillim, which means the book of praises. And one of the things scholars often do is break the Psalms up into different categories. There will be hymns of praise. There will be corporate songs of thanksgiving, the enthronement songs, and there were worship songs. And when scholars do this, when they categorize Psalms according to their genre, by far the most common kind of psalm is called the Psalm of Lament. And that's just kind of a nice way of saying a psalm of complaint. Now I'll give you an example. This is from Psalm 44, which is one of the most common psalms of complaint. This is what the psalmist says, and this is addressed to God. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, like gaining nothing from their sale. All this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. Awake, Lord. Why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. That's quite striking language to use for God, isn't it? Wake up, God. The Israelites devoted more psalms to complaining than any other single category. So when you feel like God is absent, the first practice you need to engage in is you need to complain. Now, this is very good news, isn't it? I wonder if you either already know how to complain or you'd be willing to learn. I wonder if you've discovered that complaining is in fact your spiritual gift. This is an interesting thing to me because in our day, in modern Christianity, we're not taught to do this. When I was growing up, I was taught a little acronym for prayer. You may know this. It's ACTS, A-C-T-S. But the C did not stand for complaining in that little acronym. We're not taught to do this. An Old Testament scholar named Alan Davis has written that in the ancient world, these prayers of complaint are without parallel in other religions. In no other culture did people pray to their God or gods in language that was so frank and even so rude. God, why are you sleeping? God, why do you hide your face? Lord, you have crushed us. Why do you forge our misery? How long, O Lord, how long? People of other ancient religions pray. I mean, people have always prayed. They made requests. They would offer worship. They sometimes prayed for their god or gods to curse other people. But in all of the ancient world, only Israel prayed these kinds of prayers of complaint. And I think for a really good reason. Because only Israel in all the ancient world believed that this great, sovereign, mysterious God who made the heavens and the earth cares that I'm in pain and can be expected to do something about it. Only Israel had a God like that. And so they prayed these prayers of complaint a lot. Now, what makes them so powerful and what makes them a very important part of your spiritual life and mine is that they're not just random complaining. Anyone can just complain. These psalms are always addressed directly to God, always. A quick aside. I watched a movie with my son recently. It's a movie you may have seen called Bruce Almighty. It's with Jim Carrey, who is not a real profound theological thinker. At one point in the film, he's talking to Morgan Freeman, the character who portrays God, and he's told to pray. And so he thinks about what would be an appropriate prayer. And so he ends up saying, feed all of the hungry people and bring peace to the world. And then he says, how is that prayer? And Morgan Freeman says, well, it's pretty good if you're running for Miss America. One of the reasons why why prayer dies in people is that people pray polite little prayers that are not really connected to what's going on inside of them. Of course, inside of me is a lot of junk and mixed up motives and messed up stuff, but there's not going to be the opportunity for that to get dealt with and set right unless I honestly, openly bring it out with God. And then I can trust that God's going to do something about what it is that I care about. But where it starts is you've got to be passionately honest with God. It's when you're not indulging in self-pity or martyrdom or passive resignation, but genuinely opening yourself up to God. When you complain, it's like you're hoping that God can still be trusted. You're asking God to create the kind of condition in your heart that will make praise possible once again. And that will happen. And that will happen in you. It happened for the psalmist. And it may not happen right away. It may not happen overnight, because the only place you can meet God is in reality. And sometimes reality is a messy, confusing place. So I'll bet you didn't expect to hear this, but it may be for your spiritual growth that you need to learn how to complain more. And here's the deal. When it comes to learning to complain more, I bet you can do it. I bet you can. All right, the second practice, again, in a single word, when God feels far away, lean. Lean on other people. Don't go through God's absence alone. In the Old Testament, if you had to think of one person who is maybe the most famous of anyone in the Bible for all that he suffered, who had pretty much his whole life wiped out, who would that person be? It would be Job. And if you read the book of Job, you would discover that much of the book of Job is in fact a complaint to God that keeps Job in the game spiritually. And so the practice that we see in this one is Job did not suffer God's absence alone. Job needed some people. And you have to choose the people that you're going to lean on with great care. You know, the first person in Job's life that we read about was his wife. After he lost everything, he lost his children, his wealth, his health. He's sitting on an ash heap, scraping the sores of his body with broken shards of pottery. Do you know what advice his wife gave him? Curse God and die. Like, this would not have been encouraging to Job. This would not be a good bumper sticker verse. Like, you're not going to see people drive around on the back of their car. Like, curse God and die is not going to sell. When trouble hits, I wouldn't make Mrs. Job my first choice for a leanie. If I'm going to be a leaner, I've got to choose the leanie with care. Now, after her, we read about three friends. And this is what the text says about the three friends in Job chapter 2. When they heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. These are signs of great mourning. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. You may know that Job's friends have taken a lot of criticism over the years. But let me ask you a question. Who do you have in your life that is so devoted to you that they would sit next to you for 7 days and 7 nights in silence during your time of trouble? When God feels absent, you need a few people who will be fully present. People that you know will be praying for you. People who will listen to your most honest thoughts without judging you, without coddling you. People who will point you back to God. The key with this point is don't wait until trouble hits. Like, don't wait until the ark gets carried off. Be building those relationships now. If you lead a small group, help the people in your group to learn to listen to each other. They may not be able to handle 7 days of being silent in your small group, but you can start with 7 seconds. Just 7 seconds of being quiet and listening, and then kind of just build up from there. This leads to the third practice, which in one word is still. Psalm 46 is the psalm about the world in turmoil. And the psalmist famously says, "Be still and know that I am God." Would you be willing to say one of the problems that you face in your spiritual life is you have too much peace and quiet? When God feels absent, a lot of times we go into overdrive and we frantically try to fill up our lives with noise and activity as a way to do pain avoidance. There is a time to stop drowning in activity and information and noise and just be still. Very often, pain is when we need to be still the most, but we want it the least because we just want something that will distract us from what hurts. Often, God has to walk us through a process. I think of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. He feels deserted by God. Queen Jezebel wants to kill him, and he's been on adrenaline overload for quite a while. He wants to die. He said to God, "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And God leads him to a cave. And God has to prepare Elijah to listen to him. There's an interesting progression just to quiet him down. God starts by giving him some food. God does with him what you would do with a cranky toddler. He gives him a little food, he tells him to take a nap, and then he sends him on a journey to a cave. There's an interesting progression in the phenomenon that Elijah experiences in the cave. And I've never really thought about this until this week. There's an interesting decrease in volume in what Elijah experiences. First, there's a loud wind, like a tornado. Do you know what the volume of a tornado is? I mean, you can't hear a thing if the wind gets really loud. Or a tornado would get Elijah's attention. But the text says that God was not in the tornado. And then there's an earthquake. An earthquake can rumble pretty good, but they're not as loud as tornadoes. But God wasn't in that. And then there's a fire. And the fire produces less noise than a tornado or an earthquake, but it still can roar. Well, God wasn't in that. Finally, when God decides that Elijah has quieted down enough to listen, there's a still small voice, and that's God. God just says, "Be still." I think in times of great pain, the hardest thing in the world sometimes is just to be still. About 12 years ago, during a very raw and painful time in my life, I just sat on the floor in my office and just cried. And I remember that day so vividly. I had a real clear sense of God saying to me, I want you to give this to me. I was in kind of like a personal crisis. It wasn't like a scandalous deal, but it was very, very deep for me. And a lot of you will have those kinds of experiences of God saying to you, I want you to let go of this. This is not for you to handle on your own. And that was honestly one of the hardest things for me. I mean, I was just weeping over that and saying, all right, God, I'll give it to you. If you want me to give it to you, God, I will give it to you. But it was very hard. Eventually for me, on the other side, there was this great freedom in that. But I would have never experienced that in my life if there hadn't been some time of just being still when I didn't want to be still because it hurt. There are times when it feels like God is far away. And there comes a time for you not to read more, not to try more, not to fix more, not to get more advice, but just to be still with God. All right, the fourth practice is something we do whenever we gather together as a church. Israel talked about this one a lot. The psalmist said this, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. We remember. One of the most important things you can do in your spiritual life is just to stir up memories of times when God spoke to you and comforted you and guided you and helped you and loved you, so that in the dark days when God feels far away, you can remember. Israel did that all the time. It's one of the reasons why we have the Old Testament scriptures, because they were devoted to remembering. You may know they were, for the most part, an illiterate society. Like, estimates are that even in Jesus' day, literacy in his area was somewhere around 3%. The stories that we have in the Old Testament are stories that would get memorized and remembered and handed down from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And one of the stories that Israel loved to remember the most, especially later on when they were in exile, was this story from 1 Samuel about when the ark had been carried off, about when it felt like God was in exile, but God freed himself. I want to spend the last part of this message remembering the story. And when we get to 1 Samuel 5, here's what's happening. Israel has been defeated in the battle with the Philistines. The Ark of the Covenant has been carried off. Now we're going to leave Israel behind for just a little bit and go to where it's just the Philistines and God, the Ark of the Covenant. So here's what the Philistines do. They have this huge parade. They carry the Ark of the Covenant to the temple of their god in the Philistine city, Ashdod. Their god's name was Dagon. Ashdod is where they had this great temple. And they take their victory in battle as a sign that their god, Dagon, had triumphed over the God of Israel, over Yahweh. And the Ark of the Covenant is brought to the priest in this temple. And they take it inside and they seat it down in the temple next to the statue of Dagon, this great statue. And all of the Philistines cheer about how Dagon has prevailed over the God of the Israelites. They have a big feast and they chant all of their favorite chants, and they would tell about battle stories. You know, the soldiers would tell about all their battle stories the way we do when we, tell stories about fish or golf, which is to lie and make up stuff about how well they've done. And then everyone goes home. And now it's night. And there's no one around to see or hear what's going on in the temple, and something happens in the night. When the people of Ashdod rose early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They're ready to celebrate the victory, and their god, Dagon, has fallen on his face before the ark of the Lord. Now, the writer of Scripture doesn't tell us what the people thought. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But it looks as if Dagon has bowed down to worship the God of Israel. It looks as if God, the God of Israel, is the Lord of Lords. Now, the priests realize this kind of thing is not good for business, to have your God bowing down before another God. And so they dust their God off, they prop him back up, and they continue with their celebration. Like, understand, the Ashdodites are coming into the temple to offer sacrifices, to celebrate their victory, to sing songs to Dagon. They do that all day long. The priests are there all day long. And then it's night, and the priest turns off the light, and they go home, and they leave Dagon alone with Yahweh in the temple in the dark. And Dagon says to himself, well, here we go again. The following morning, when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. Now, wouldn't you love to know what happened in the night? Like, what's so frustrating about this text is the writer doesn't tell us what happened in the night. That is, at this point, only for God to know. And all we know about this story is that it is a 3-day story. The first day is a very dark day, and it looks like God is defeated. The glory is gone from Israel. Heaven is silent, and no one can understand why. That's the first day. Some days in life are like that. The second day in the story is a day of hidden combat. It's shrouded in mystery. It's a day of ambiguity and uncertainty and anxiety, and really some days in life are a lot like that. The third day, that's God's day. There's night, but our God does some of his best work at night. And on the morning of the third day, all the powers opposed to God get defeated, and idols get disarmed, and stones get rolled away, and people are filled with awe and wonder, because on the third day, that's the day of hope. This is a 3-day story, and the third day is God's day. Now, from this point on in the story, Yahweh is on the march. God will not be stopped. Judgment comes to the Philistines in the form of a physical affliction. And now this part of the story gets a little gross, and I'm just going to warn you about that now. And I would apologize for it, except it comes right out of the Bible. God sends a plague to the Philistines, and it involves mice in some ways and physical suffering, physical affliction in other ways. Now, exactly what this physical affliction is was a little difficult to translate. The New International Version uses the word tumors, which is kind of a polite choice. The King James Bible is more literal. This is what it says: "But the hand of the Lord was heavy upon the Ashdodites, and he destroyed them and smote them with hemorrhoids, both Ashdod and its territories." In verse 9, it says, they had hemorrhoids in their secret parts, which is where hemorrhoids usually go. I'm just going to allow you to insert your own joke there because I don't want to get in trouble. Now, the obvious question is, why would this detail make it into the Bible? I mean, it's kind of a weird thing, isn't it? Like, what got into whoever was writing the Bible at this point? Like when he asked his wife, hey, honey, take a look at this and see if you think it would make a good chapter in the Bible. Like, why didn't she say, keep that out? You see, this is a very deliberate part of the story. And here's why. These were the Philistines. These were the enemies of God's people. And they were very powerful. They were living in the Iron Age. Remember, the Israelites, they didn't even have a single smith in their whole country because they didn't have that technology. The Philistines did. The writer wants the readers to know, and you and I to know, don't be afraid of your enemies. Don't envy them. Don't try to be like them. If for a while it looks like the Philistines are going to come out on top, don't be deceived. That's first day stuff. The third day is coming. In the presence of God's judgment, the writer wants us to know that all people are just embarrassingly human. These very powerful Philistines are embarrassingly human. And all their iron swords and spears and shields and chariots don't do them any good, because what they need right now is inflatable cushions to sit on. While the Iron Age had arrived, the inflatable cushion age was still centuries away, and iron was the last thing that they wanted to sit on. So the Ashdodites decide that having the Ark of the Covenant in their town is really not such a great idea after all. And they call a meeting of the security council of the Philistines, and they say, what shall we do? What shall we do with the Ark of God of Israel? And one of them, this bright one, says, well, let's send it to Gath. Gath is another one of the 5 major Philistine cities. Of course, news travels kind of slowly in those days. There's no phone calls, there's no emails. So the Gath people are like, great, we get the Ark. But pretty soon, the Gathites are looking for something soft to sit on. And this time, there's no council meeting, no consulting with the elders. They just decide to FedEx the Ark to Ekron, another big city. Now, by this time, the word starts to spread. And while the Ark is being delivered, the text says that the Ekronites start crying out, oh, no, you don't. Not here, not in our backyard. And they consult with Dagon, the Dagon priest. What should we do about this? What should we do with the Ark? And the priests say, well, let's send it back to Israel, along with a bribe to get Yahweh to stop hurting us, to not hurt us anymore, just to kind of seal the deal with them. So they agree to send 5 gold mice, and I'm not making this up, 5 gold hemorrhoids. So there is a cart with the Ark and 5 gold mice and 5 gold hemorrhoids. Here's what the priests say. But maybe our problems are not due to Israel's gods at all. Maybe this is all just a coincidence, this suffering and plagues that we've been going through. So we'll do a test. And this is what they do in 1 Samuel. They put the Ark on a cart, and they hitch the cart up to 2 cows. Now, both of these cows are milking cows. They're nursing calves. These are cows that have never worked before. They've never pulled a cart before. Their calves are back in the barn, back to the west. In the opposite direction is Israel, the city of Beth Shemesh, that the cows are supposed to move towards. And here's what the priests say. If these milking cows desert their calves, who are nursing, and go on to Israel, then we'll know that Yahweh did this, that he brought this suffering on us. But if the cows go home to their calves, then we'll know it was just all a coincidence and Yahweh didn't do anything. Now, what are the odds that 2 cows who have never pulled a cart before, who are nursing their calves, would deny their maternal instincts, say no to the needs to nurse, desert their children, and go to a country they'd never been into in their life? Like, what are the odds of that? And by the way, if they did go home to their calves, who do you think would get to keep the gold? The priests, most likely. And so they arrange this pile of gold on the cart. The cows get hitched up to the cart, and all of the Philistines are watching. The priests are watching. Everyone's holding their breath. Now the wheels on the cart begin to turn, and the cows are not going home. These mothers are not going to their little infant calves. They're going to Israel. Imagine the priest's response when the cows start moving and they're traveling east. Like, no, you stupid cows. Like, how could you leave your children? What kind of mothers are you? Like, what are we going to do with the gold now? The text says the cow took the straight way in the direction to Beth Shemesh. They went along the road and did not turn aside from the right or to the left. Now, that's kind of a technical phrase. Did not turn aside to the right or to the left is a technical expression often used in the Old Testament to indicate unwavering obedience to the will of God. And it's from these 2 cows. Well, Brueggemann, who's a great Old Testament scholar, said the hinge of this whole story is Yahweh's irresistible determination to return to his people. This is what he writes. Yahweh is unstoppable and irresistible and on his way home. Perhaps Yahweh kept asking the Philistine cows in eagerness, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Can you imagine that trip? The Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the God of Israel, and 2 milking cows. The text says they mooed the whole way. It doesn't say why they mooed. I'll tell you what I think. I'll tell you my guess. I remember another parade when God was coming to his people, when Jesus was entering Jerusalem and the people were making noise and the people were waving palm branches and singing and dancing and shouting, and the leaders, the Pharisees, they told Jesus to shut up, to shut the people up. And Jesus says, if I do that, the rocks would cry out. Because when God comes home to his people, there's just got to be praise. There's got to be noise. Maybe the cows mooed all the way to Israel because God was coming home to his people, and there just had to be praise. Some of God's creatures had to make noise, and if the cows were silent, then maybe the rocks would have cried out. And then they take the ark all the way home. God comes home to his people, and more amazing things happen in this story, but we're going to stop here. God comes home to his people. God just refuses to leave his people alone. So in these moments in your life when God feels absent, and sometimes those moments will come. If right now you're living in the first day, maybe that's where you are, and things look dark. Or you're living in the second day and things look kind of ambiguous. Your job and my job is to keep complaining and keep leaning and keep being still, and remember that our God is a God of the third day. Whatever your life is like right now, making sure that everything comes out right is not ultimately up to you or me. Our job is to hang on and not lose hope, and remember that we serve the God of the third day, and the third day will come. Remember that although in our world sometimes sorrow may last for a night, our God does some of his best work at night, and joy comes in the morning. Remember that although it looks like Dagon is pretty strong, he's coming down. Although sometimes the way of the Philistines seems pretty compelling and pretty successful, it's headed for judgment. Although sometimes you might feel incompetent or inadequate or not gifted enough or not faithful enough, remember that God can use 2 milking cows to get his work done. Think of what he can do through you. Remember that though at times it feels like God is a long way off, he's closer than you think. One day he will return to set everything right. One day he will come home because he's the God of the third day. All right, let me pray for you. God, for those people who are going through this trial right now in life where it feels like you're absent, I pray that they would remember this lesson and that they would lean into these truths from 1 Samuel 5. God, help us to live this way when we're going through pain or experiencing trouble or problems that just seem insurmountable. God, help us to remember that you are the God of the third day. That even though the first day is difficult and the second day leaves us feeling ambiguous about things, that you are the God of the third day. That in the third day, that's when you do your greatest work. That you're shaping us and you're molding us, you're getting us ready for your return. God, help us to lean into these practices when we feel like you're absent. And may they, for some of us, like maybe complaining is something that we don't do very easily. So help us to just be honest with you about how we're feeling when we feel that you're absent. Help us to find people in our lives that we can lean on and find the support that we need. Help us to be still. Just know that you are God. And help us to remember all those times in our lives where you spoke to us and you led us and you guided us and you helped us and you loved us, so that when we're in the night, we can remember those memories will get us through that night. God, I just pray that you would continue to do your work in us, continue to shape us and mold us, continue to prepare us for what's next. I ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.